Welcome to the 3030 Health Podcast. The following discussion is for education and entertainment. It is not intended to diagnose or treat disease. Please do not apply any of this information without first discussing it with your doctor. Here is your host, Dr. Ruiz.
Hello everyone, super excited to have my friend Scott Jeffrey on the show today. For over 2 decades, Scott has been helping high-performing entrepreneurs, CEOs, best-selling authors, and thought leaders access their superhuman potential. He accomplishes this by integrating principles, insights, and methods from Taoist philosophy, humanistic psychology, qigong, alchemy, transpersonal studies, emotional intelligence training, and many other modalities that help leaders scale their businesses without burning out. Me and Scott had a great conversation today. Share this podcast with your friends and family and write a review on iTunes. It really helps the podcast out. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the show. Hello everyone, super excited to have one of my dear friends from PaleoFX, Scott Jeffrey. Scott, we met about 3 or 4 years ago. We see each other like once a year and they're like, hey, you should go to my podcast. And it finally happened. How are you, man?
Finally here. I'm great. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So this is going to be a really interesting talk, and before we get into, all the cool stuff that you're doing with Asian knowledge and Taoism, and archetypes and, self-actualization and slaying dragons, for my listeners that might not recognize your name, what's your hero story?
Well, let's see. When I got out of school, it was during like the heyday of the internet. So it was the kind of time where investors were throwing money at you if you looked smart and you were young. And so I had a few internet companies. The second one was going quite well. And then the internet bubble burst, the funding dried up, and I was left to figure out what to do next. The passion at the time was really more in self-development, but I was working with a number of my investors were in the Tony Robbins circles. They were in his inner circle, his platinum partners. And I started to work with one of them first, helped him transform his business, actually a series of businesses, and then he told another platinum partner, hey, you got to talk to this guy. He's kind of like a young Tony type of thing. And so I just went with that for a while and started building up a coaching practice, working with entrepreneurs, being probably younger than I should be at the time to be doing what I was doing, but I didn't say anything and somehow it was working. So we went with it for a while, and that actually continued on up till the present in many different incarnations. It's been over a 20-year journey of discovery, but it was one of those things where, when you're in that kind of innocent, open-minded space where you really don't know, when someone asks you, can you do something, you just kind of go, let me get back to you. and then you go and you, thankfully I was a quick study. I'd figure out how to work, what are the best practices, what would apply best in that situation, and then move on. And so over time, I built up kind of an arsenal of different ways of approaching different problems, both on the business side and what was more my passion, which was on the self-development side. And over time, I began to see that the issues people were having were mainly not in their business. It was mainly they were the ones hijacking themselves. And I started to see later on how I was also doing the same thing and hijacking myself. And then I went from different external approaches to more of an internal focus on what's actually going on in our psyche. And that was more of my, the first portion was all my 20s, and then my 30s was more exploring the inner dimensions and going into different practices, both East and West. And then later on, finding a way to synthesize them into more of a cohesive, integrated model that I can use in coaching and working with people to help them kind of discover what's going on inside of them, just as I was doing the same for myself.
It's so interesting because I just went to a conference about, business and, self-actualization and mindshare in San Diego, and one of the messages that hit me the hardest, Brendan Burchard was there speaking, and he said, the biggest enemy you have is your own proficiency. And that hit me really hard because I can see myself
going to, like places like PaleoFX, AHS, and I can like really turn it on and walk in there and just make friends. Imagine if I prepared, like if I wasn't as good as connecting with people, if I wasn't as extroverted. And that was like super like, oh shit, ever since that day, that was, a couple of weeks ago, I've been preparing harder. And it's these little nuggets of information that are coming from a different person. What are some other things that change maybe your life or have like the biggest impact for your clients that people are not doing and maybe we should start doing?
Well, I'll caveat this to say that this idea is so simple that it's too easy to discount it, because our complex minds like to discount the simple. But I think the most important practice that we can use, whether entrepreneur or not, is to learn how to pause. We've kind of, our entire culture is obsessed with moving as fast as we can, of optimizing, of being more effective, of being more productive. But if you look at the root of even productivity, you're talking about a term that was relegated to produce, right? Which is like agricultural crops. It wasn't really something designed for humans. But we like to, we've come to associate the brain as a machine and humans as a machine. And so we think we can keep running. And so the ability to pause, to get perspective, and pause to not just get perspective, but also get outside of ourselves, to step outside and look at ourselves, right, from the observer self. I think that's probably one of the most powerful practices someone can integrate into their way of being, because you'll start to see the insanity. And then it's easier to see in other people, right? Because everyone's a mirror. So you see what they're doing. You're like, at first there's judgment, right? And then if there's enough self-awareness, you're going to be like, oh, wow, I'm like that too. Or you're going to be like, I'm like that too, but I don't know how yet. And so that pausing and that as a practice is a way of just kind of getting like back to your center, to like come to a new set point and evaluate things in a new way. It's also great for establishing a reservoir of mental energy that we tend to overextend very easily.
Even in your little intro, you said that when people would come to you and say, hey, can you help me? Can you look at my business? Can you, you would say, I'll get back to you.
Yeah, I'll get back to you, right? When someone asks you something, I feel like we have to have the answer right there. But the truth is, and that's conditioned in school, right? A teacher asks you a question. If you don't know it right away, you're screwed, right? It's like you're not prepared. But the reality is that a lot of times you need to kind of pause, look up, and access the information from a part of your mind that's just not accessible in that moment, especially when a teacher or someone else is looking at you saying, what's the answer? What's the answer? What's the answer? Say it now, say it now, say it now, right? You start to feel that energy that stops the process from coming up. And I did a book a while back on creativity, and that was one of the consistent themes you see in those people we call creative geniuses, is they always appreciated the periods of reverie, right, called the incubation stage, where they would either go for a walk or take a long shower, or they would just stop whatever they were doing. And it was in those moments that all their insights would come, not by working continuously.
I just read a book called Rocket Fuel, and talks about two types of people, like innovators, and how innovators, dime a dozen. Everyone wants to be an innovator. Everyone tends to want to be like the idea person. But there's also some different set of people, and they are integrators. And the integrators are the people that are putting the plan into play. So you're talking about like Ray Kroger and the brothers who started McDonald's, implementers versus innovators. Kroger, being the innovator, Steve Jobs and Wozniak, innovator, integrator. And it turns out that there's not a lot of integrators in this world. They're really, really hard to find, because people like me, we just like squash them because we're so loud, and then they want to be an innovator. But when you put those two things together, now you have rocket fuel. And that's when things go insane. Do you think we can teach this entrepreneurship to kids? Do you think, or to like a new doctor, like the worst person to start a business would be someone that is overworked, needs to see patients, and on top of that has to do numbers and strategy? Do you think this can be taught, or do you think that we should be looking for our integrator?
When you give the example of asking in terms of the children, like all the research shows that before age 5, every child is fine. Before age 5, like 98% of kids are classified as creative geniuses by the test they give in discursive thinking, divergent thinking. And then by age 15, it's about 10%, and by adulthood, it's 2%. So there's something that happens through the school system, we call it education or indoctrination system, between 5 and 15, that basically cancels out a lot of our innate aptitudes. So the challenge for the doctor is not a function of learning entrepreneurship as much as unlearning all their prior conditioning. Can it be done? Yes. More often in business, what you see happen is you see partnerships, right, of different people coming from different strengths. I personally believe more strongly in the idea of becoming integrated, right? Just like you take someone who's more right-brained, more intuitive, right, more the idea person, and you put them with someone who's more analytical, practical, left-brain. Those are different aspects of each person's being. And so this idea that you're supposed to only play to your strengths and forget about your weaknesses, I think is a huge problem, because the idea is we're all supposed to become whole, which means, yes, playing to your strengths because that's where you're going to shine, but also minding your weaknesses because that's what's going to make you whole and complete and see the world through a different lens. So I think from the standpoint of entrepreneurship, it is about accessing your whole brain. And, I think it's more of an issue. Look, like you said, in terms of ideas, anyone could come up with an idea, but the execution is usually about 90% of the journey, right, to realize that idea, if not more than that. And that's like those qualities of execution are what? Like having discipline, having will, right? Having self-management, self-awareness, self-leadership principles. So all of those are skills that any individual can develop if they have the right methods and the drive and interest in doing so.
Sometimes the implementers can get in front of themselves by trying to make everything perfect. You never ship, and shipping date is the most important, so you have a product and you have to ship. How can people learn to get from in front of themselves and allow them to be imperfect?
Sure. I think the idea from the lean startup movement is a useful concept for what you're addressing, because the idea is that you want to have what's called the MVP, the minimal viable product, right? What is going to be good enough to get customer feedback? See, one of the biggest problems in like any kind of development process is we tend to spend, and a lot of like thought leaders get hooked by this too. They'll spend a lot of time in content creation and very little time marketing or getting feedback from their audience in terms of what they're interested in. And it's never a useful approach. Instead, the idea is, how do you get to a point where you can test to see how people will respond to what you're doing, and then you continue the developmental cycle. Instead of let's try to get it perfect and put all the bells and whistles in it, right? If Microsoft did that, there would still be no Windows, right? So there is something about just continuously putting out new iterations, and like the idea of perfection is certainly something that hijacks people in this process.
What about personally? How can you let go of that perfectionism?
Well, like so many of these things that drive because really perfectionism is just one example of like neuroses, right, of a neurotic behavior. The first thing that really has to happen for like long-term change, not like a quick hack that's going to help in that moment and then you got to deal with it again, but for a real structural change in consciousness, you need to first understand where that's coming from, like why there's such a strong drive to be a perfectionist and what it means. And that self-reflection usually brings you back to some childhood situation, usually some parent being very harsh and demanding and potentially rejecting of the individual. And so now that drive to perfectionism is driven by an internal voice that we tend not to hear, that's basically saying, am I good enough yet? Am I okay now? Am I okay now? And because there's never a response that's saying yes, it's just running, 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 trying to be perfect, but it can't, because it's like it's fighting against a phantom that doesn't exist. But those things, they go on in our psyche like every day, but we don't tend to tune in. And again, this is where the pausing comes in, right? Because a lot of what's driving like our perfectionism, our workaholism, whatever it is just not wanting to hear these internal voices that are usually younger parts of us that are kind of screaming for our attention. I'd say a lot of our, a lot of things that we try to like health-wise address on the physical level are also manifestations from these psychic components that are more at the root of the origin, but they're harder to get to. You need kind of a psychic surgery type of thing where you can diagnose it and then work with it internally. But that's not available to all of us.
So within this perfectionism, I think I can identify, with my parents being demanding, in a loving way, but always demanding. Could this be the reason that I tend to gravitate towards, like mentors, searching for their approval? And thankfully, my mentors are so supportive and also like congratulate me, and that's so meaningful. Could that be why I'm like getting like rocket fueled into this,
Certainly, anyone that we might project any level of authority into, usually in some shape or form, represents the parent, which is like the one of the other parent, which was the initial authority. And so, however our needs weren't met then, we're still seeking to meet them in our adult life. And that's part of this journey of like you say, the hero's journey, right? The hero's journey is really ultimately about bringing all that authority that we've been projecting out our entire lives and then bringing it back in, right? Recollecting the projection, as it's called. And then like, kind of like we've put out our magic and our power everywhere. And now it's about grabbing it, bringing it back, bringing it back, bringing it back, and then like, constellating it in ourselves so that we have that authority within. And at that point, there's no longer a need for anything outside of you for validation, praise, approval, or anything like that.
Can you talk a little bit about like the hero's journey?
Well, who popularized the idea of the hero's journey was Joseph Campbell, who wrote The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And what Campbell was a mythologist who instead, he was different than other mythologists. Other mythologists would compare and find what was different from mythology to mythology. But Campbell looked for what was similar. And what he found was what's now called the monomyth, which was a theme across cultures and across time of this hero's journey. And that's why I said the hero could wear 1,000 faces, because it didn't matter what face of the hero, it was always the same adventure. And so the hero would start in the ordinary world, which is the known world. And then he would be introduced to, and I'll say he, but it's he or she, to a special world. And the special world essentially represents the unknown. It's a world that's unfamiliar and in that way dangerous. And the hero tends to refuse the call to adventure at first, right? Because it's like, no, not for me. I'm going to stay in my safe zone of what I know. But somehow ends up getting thrusted in one way or another into that adventure.
For its own development, or to save someone else, or to save a community, or, many different ways.
There's a lot of ways he can get thrusted in. Like the classic, what was in Star Wars, Luke Skywalker didn't want to go with Obi-Wan and goes back to the farm, and his aunt and uncle were fried to a crisp. And he's like, okay, I'll go. So that was his acceptance of the call. And then you meet friends and foes along the journey. You meet, like you said, You meet mentors with supernatural aid, as Campbell called it. That's kind of like the old wise man, the Gandalf character, the Morpheus type of character, who helps guide your journey at critical points along the way. And eventually you come to this innermost cave. And there you have to fight the dragon for something. The elixir, saving the princess, some treasure, something, and then return home. Now, what most people don't know about the hero's journey is that it represents the process of our development. You see, the hero itself is an archetype not of adulthood, but of adolescence.
Mm.
The hero is kind of like untested, untrue, and in a lot of ways incapable, right? And so it's through oftentimes the failures, the trials and tribulations and the defeats along the hero's journey that you begin to kind of find your limitations and then also push through certain ones to develop your strengths. And that innermost cave, and this in traditionally in the hero's journey, it was the masculine psyche that was going on the hero's journey. The dragon represents the mother complex, and the mother complex is that drive in a man to be comforted and taken care of, and that, like, the child part in them that wants to be cared for by the mother basically hinders our ability to reach full adulthood. And so the hero has to slay the dragon, at least in Western mythologies. Eastern mythologies treats it differently. They actually befriend the dragon, which is a more enlightened way. They integrate the dragon instead of destroying it. And the dragon itself has a slightly different meaning than in Western mythologies as well, but we can get into that. And then they return home. So the journey itself, the hero's journey has two different tracks. It goes on the external, which is achievement, right? So our external journeys is in our profession. It could be starting a family. It could be getting a promotion. It could be, winning a great client, whatever it is, healing somebody. Those are the external aspects of the adventure. But the real sort of magic of the hero's journey is in an inner journey, which is a transformational process. See, by the end of the journey, the hero has gone through some alchemical transformation, and if successful, will somehow be different. The classic example is like Rocky in the movie Rocky. Right? Rocky doesn't win, but yet it's transformed, right? And so that's really subconsciously what we're looking for in that journey, is that inner transformation, and what does that look like, and how do we relate to that? But it's something that captures all of us, because we are all, I mean, you look at what the research on developmental psychology from Maslow till now, and the reality is that mature adulthood is almost non-existent. It's achieved by less than 1%. And so we didn't have parents that were adults. Our parents didn't have parents that were adults. And if we're parents, we're also not adults too. And so if we know that as a starting off position, then we can have a further appreciation for the hero's journey and look at like where we're aborting our own self-actualization and where we're getting stuck, to help facilitate that process.
Can you have multiple journeys in your lifetime?
Externally, you're constantly having external journeys. And historically speaking, like if you look at like tribal cultures, the first half of life was all external journeys. And then there was a turning point where, and then, the age was different back then because of a shorter lifespan. But by 35, 40, you're going to go from being a warrior to going on a walkabout of some kind or a vision quest. And you're going to return as an elder who will then share your wisdom and knowledge from your external journeys. And then go on, then be kind of a ritual elder that will guide the transition for younger people. Essentially, you'll go from being Neo to Morpheus. And that was the idea. And that's one of the challenges we have in our culture currently, is we have a lot of like
Neos.
Luke Skywalker, a lot of Neos and not a lot of Morpheuses.
So that's why you need to like hold on to your mentors.
Hold on to them and then bring them inside. Because ultimately, again, they are only reflections of what's inside of us. And that's, again, that internal journey is supposed to be bringing those mentors in us, in our own inner council.
Wow. And what do you mean by bring them inside?
So Carl Jung's way of describing this transition from the external to the internal is, he called it like the inward turn, and this process of individuation, which is another way of describing the outcome of the hero's journey. And like if you look, say we just referenced Neo and Morpheus, so taking the example of the Matrix, like every character in that movie or in any film that you see represents different characters in the psyche of the writers, right? So when we watch a film, we tend to identify with the hero, right? We tend to identify with Neo, but you have to be able to identify with Cypher, right? With Morpheus, with Trinity, with the agents, right? Because all of those represent aspects of you. So if you look at, in the example we're talking about for mentors, it means that there's aspects, or like if you look at the best qualities in the individuals you admire, which means looking like or like, yeah, where you look up to somebody. What are those qualities? And can you find them in yourself? So not about mimicking or mirroring or anything like that. It's what happens in the first 20 years of life is we tend to cut ourselves off from a lot of aspects of ourselves, both positive and negative. And so like what's called shadow work is about becoming conscious of everything that we've kind of cut ourselves and disassociated from in the first half of life, and then reintegrating it, bring it back into us. And Nietzsche said it's like, be careful in casting out your demons, because you could be casting out the best thing in you, right? So a lot of those qualities, they might seem darker, but they're actually part of your intrinsic power. But like in the context of mentors, there's certain qualities that we think of in them. Like the problem we have in our culture is that we're always looking up or down, right? It's like someone's either ahead of you, so you're looking up to them, or they're below you, or you're looking down, right? And so it's only through the internal transformation of the hero's journey, that through this individuation process, that we can begin to look eye to eye, when you can see every flaw in someone else, in yourself, and all the greatness in somebody else inside you too.
My head is like spinning right now. And one of the things that I admire the most from my mentors is their ability to shine the spotlight on me. Because you can get into I made this person, or look at me, But like Dr. Ann Christensen helping me, with my career, Dr. Paul Mittman helping me during my school time, Keith and Michelle, giving us the biggest stage in the paleo community, and they don't ask for anything. They just want us to represent the cause. How can we become mentors like them? How can we become better mentors for the people, that might be looking up to us, but they should be looking at the same level as us?
Well, I think you're just describing it. You're taking note of the behaviors that you want to model, right? That you're admiring, and you're like learning through the observing of behavior what to do. Ultimately, we pay much less attention to what people say than we realize. We're mostly watching people's behavior on a subconscious, unconscious level. And so if you're taking note, at first, you have to you're going to see resistance in yourself, right? Because there's a part of you, like, let's say you're identifying aspects of like selflessness, right? Or what you might define as selflessness. So if you're admiring it, then you might, for example, first look at like aspects of our selfishness, because we're all like intrinsically very selfish individuals, which again, as our culture, we say this is bad, but it just is. And it's not good or bad or anything else. Even in developmental psychology, we tend to go from egocentrism to sociocentrism to world-centrism, meaning like we go from being focused on ourselves to identification with our group, and then to identification with like humanity. And so, if you're at more of a level of being more focused on your own gain, and which when you're younger, that's actually more appropriate. Like the older you get, the more generative you're supposed to become. So like it doesn't mean like in your 20s and 30s you're supposed to be worried about the next generation, right? But you can be taking note of people that are, and then say, okay, as I become a wise older person, this is how I want to behave, and But the main thing that I think trips people up is the lack of self-honesty. Is just being delusional in terms of like thinking you are one way when you're being another. As long as you're honest, I think everyone naturally works it out. But it starts by having mentors that you like. That's already half the battle, where you have people that you want to model. I think, like people that are taking like celebrities, for example. as models and then watching their behaviors. Like there's not many good models in the public scene, and the more you go, even like spiritual teachers, I've done a number of deep dives into the lives of different individuals, and it's always a sobering experience. And if you have any projections, you are always left with disillusionment, because what you're seeing in the media versus what's in reality, in my experience, is always different.
Ooh, can you give us an example?
Years ago, I wrote a biography on a spiritual teacher who was well known at the time. His name was David R. Hawkins. He wrote a book called Power versus Force, which is like a science of consciousness. He was an MD, PhD, and created this whole map of consciousness. And I became his biographer. This is how I got into a lot of the psychological work. And in being his biographer, I started to come to the conclusion that pretty much, well, from a scientific perspective, everything he's saying was not grounded. His testimonials weren't real. His PhD wasn't legitimate. It was like over and over and over again. Now, I still think he had a lot of great aspects to his teachings, and I didn't think at all, and I still don't, that he was a charlatan in any way. But in coming to understand how the shadow operates, and this what's called the Jungians call like the Messiah complex or the God complex, when that starts to take hold, which it does in many spiritual teachers, you start to believe that you're invincible and that anything you do is for the greater good. And so in that point, there's no, and incidentally, he had part of his teaching was on integrity and levels of integrity, and that you'll find very common. And whatever a teacher's talking about is what they're working through themselves. And so as long as you take that as the case, then there's no projection.
How often should you be, working on yourself? How do you coach this to an entrepreneur who's overworked, and then you say, hey, dude, you need to chill out, you need to pause, and you need to have some introspection? How do you convince someone to actually work on this stuff?
Ultimately, that depends on the context, right? If it depends where they're at in their life stage, where they are in their hero's journey. If they're still fighting these battles to try to like win the princess type of thing, to win the treasure kind of thing. Again, it sounds sexist to say that, but you get the idea. It's from the mythologies.
Yeah. Or Mario.
Or Mario, right? right. If that's the case, like everyone they're on their own ship, and so that ship has a certain momentum, and so you can't tell it to stop, right? And so for that person, you might have to help them get closer to where they want to be first to realize that's not actually what they want, right? Like a lot of us have to like achieve the things that we think that we want before, and either achieve it or get knocked down, one or the other. Then there's like a moment of humility where the ego pauses long enough to be open to this stuff. But I could say that, working with considerable number of people over the last 2 decades, everyone's at a different place, and that's part of the art, is to kind of get a feel for where that person's at and their level of receptivity, and then tailor specific methods for that individual that's going to be best for them. Like I could say, like one of the things, I have this program called the Mastery Method, where literally I teach people in 1 minute, in 60 seconds, how to drop their energy down from their head into their body, right? And ultimately it should be done in 30 seconds. Because this idea of like people have for meditation, right, where you tell people to meditate for 30 minutes, like tell a high achiever that's running every day, like all day long, like, and tell them to sit and meditate. It's sadistic. I mean, it's really sadistic, because and it's totally actually in a lot of ways harmful, because even they're going to do it like an achiever, right? They're going to say, oh, hey, I meditated. They're going to check it off a list, right? And feel good about themselves. They meditated, and they just created a new part, the meditator part, that's totally separate from their achiever part. So the idea we talked about before with pause, it's the same kind of thing. It's like, how do you work with your existing momentum and bring awareness to it? So to answer your question, in terms of how much you're working on yourself, eventually you develop a self-reflective part that's constantly looking back most of the time, ideally all the time. Even in the traditions, sitting meditation was designed as a way of setting the context, and then you were supposed to maintain the practice throughout the day. Otherwise, you're creating like a meditator part and your other regular ego. So here you're always reflecting back. Now, is there times where you're going to lose it and just get totally absorbed in what you're doing and like not have any self-awareness? Sure. And then it's a function of how quickly can you get back to it, right? So for some people, they have to do it a few times a day. If something's going on and it just doesn't, they don't feel good, they don't know why. Can you pause long enough to like look back to a conversation, and then you might see an image of that person's face, and they looked at you a certain way. Now, it's never about how someone looks at you. It's a matter of always what happened in the past. Heidegger said, like, the devastation has already happened. It's because it happened in childhood. So it's just a function of, can you stay still long enough for it to track back and say, okay, that's what's happening. And then it sort of releases, and then you can move on.
Wow. And all of this can be taught. Because like we are indoctrinated in this educational system to be productive, back to, I was having a conversation with Chris Masterjohn, about a year ago, and he was telling me how, the reason school starts at a certain time and has a lunch break, it was just to create workers. In the industrialized system. So we have been inoculated with productivity, and how do you tell someone to shed that and to, go into this different way of thinking, and by doing this less seemingly unproductive things become even more productive by being self-actualized?
Right. There's a developmental model called spiral dynamics that explains the different value structures that we have at different stages of development. And I don't go too deep into it, but in relation to your question, I think this will help give it context. There's the orange achiever self that is kind of what we've been conditioned with, right? Because our culture is this about achievement. So this part of us, the problem we have in development is that what we tend to do is go to a new level and then cut off what was below it. Right? So we want to, like what you were just asking in terms of like, how do we move from this to this? If we do it with disassociation by cutting off, we create more problems. So instead, like what integral theory explains is you transcend and include, right? So you don't let go of this productive part that has been cultivated through your development. What you do is you begin to introduce a new part. And the part above that is green, which is the sensitive self. It's the one that's more tuned into feelings, that's more interested in rights, environment, things like that. But ultimately, you have to get beyond that to what's called the yellow stage structure, which is integration, which means, and this is really the answer to the question, is like you have to develop an access point in yourself, which is in the traditions, in like Taoism, it's called the original spirit. It's often called the center. And so we all have this sort of center inside of us. And Joseph Campbell talked about that too. He said there's the center inside of you, and if you lose it, your life goes into disarray, into disorganization, which is the case for most of us because everything in our environment is designed to take us out of that center. And so from that center, you can access this productive part when you need to be productive, and then toggle it off when you don't. Right? And so the problem isn't that we can be productive. The problem is that we think we need to be productive all the time. It's like, can you be productive for 2 hours and then completely shut down that operating system for a while until you need to use it again? That and all the peak performance literature also shows is actually a more effective way of training and developing is by going in sprints. Turning it on and then powering down and resting, recovering, doing something totally mindless.
Wow. And even with diet, you talk about, you got to be vegan or you got to be completely keto, where, the best part would be to be metabolically flexible to, if you need to eat a ton, you can eat a ton. If you need to fast for a day, no problem.
Sure. And that brings up a really important point, because I think so much of what we see in the health space is all predicated on this idea that you need the willpower to follow through on a specific regimen. And if we introduce the idea of how the psyche operates, there's an important lesson. What you resist persists. What you resist grows stronger. So if you try to suppress like a certain desire, it's going to go get stronger. And the research shows this. If you look at the research on dieting, something like 90 or 95% of dieters end up gaining more weight when they're done with the diet, right? Which is just an illustration of this simple principle. And so if through integration, instead what you're doing from your center, you start to tune into what your body is saying, right? So if there's certain thing that you're doing for your health, and it doesn't feel good, if you're conscious, if you're aware of that feeling in your body, eventually that gets anchored. And then you're no longer having to wrestle with that part that's wanting to do the thing that's destructive. So again, that self-awareness piece is so important in those changes, but not trying to force it is very important, because that's what the achiever self does. It's like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to stick to it for the next 30 days. And it creates a lot more problems. Again, it's a form of neuroses.
Now, we're going to be part of the Biohacker Summit, Biohacker Effects, and Keith Norris is going to be interviewing us. What are you going to talk about to him? I'm going to talk about botanical medicine, and we're going to have a really cool Earth level conversation with some science sprinkled in. But you guys are going to talk some next level stuff. What are you guys going to be talking about?
We're gonna go interstellar.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Well, it's like, again, there's so many really amazing things happening in the biohacking space in terms of like ways of improving mental and physical performance. But if you look at what's driving so much of this, and the reason why so much of this is important, even on like a hormonal level, is that we don't address what's going on in our shadow, right? We don't address all the things that we're repressing. We don't address all the archetypes, all these like behavioral patterns that are essentially running the show. They're driving the school bus, and we don't even realize it. And so we'll probably dive into that, try to look at like examine some of those characters in the psyche that are influencing our behavior to the point that we have lost control, and begin to see it so that we can kind of objectify it. Because once we could objectify it, we get space from it. And once we get space from it, we're no longer influenced to the same degree.
What are the archetypes?
So Jung popularized the idea of archetypes as well. Archetypes are essentially like primordial images or patterns of behavior. They're ancient in that they've been sort of pre-installed in our psyche for, say millions of years, depending on what belief system you come from. But the point is, they've been around since the beginning of at least recorded history. And so, like, again, the best example, or the most well-known example of an archetype, is the hero. The hero has specific behavioral patterns, specific sort of qualities and characteristics that we identify with the hero, so we could say that's a hero. Same with a villain, right? Same with a trickster, right? And so it's fun because you could go into films and you could identify those characters. The key part then is to take those characters and begin to identify how they're operating inside of us, because we don't necessarily see the image or hear the voices in us, but they're in us. They're all in us. And so all of those, like what advertisers do, like the intelligent ones, the clever ones, the savvy ones, they're activating specific archetypes in us to get us to take a specific action that they want. And so it's like luxury brands, for example, are designed to trigger specific archetypes that are interested in those luxuries, the values of those brands, and get us to to desire it in some way. So all of these are, like most of us, again, when I said the mature adulthood is achieved by a very small percentage, until that integration point comes where there's like full consciousness, full awareness from a behavioral perspective, from a psychological perspective, it essentially means that different archetypes are running the show. And it's not just one, it's a family of them. Some research in subpersonality says there's like 12 dominant ones in the psyche. I personally think it's closer to 50. Depends on how you differentiate it. And it starts to, you look at your personal relationships, you start to see there's different dynamics. The longer time you spend with someone, the more you start to see that this person is not the same person than they met before, right? And usually you have to spend more time with them in close quarters to see that. And what's happening is you're really starting to identify the different archetypes that are playing within them. And we each have a family of them. So it's about the individuation process is really, again, coming back to the center where all of these different archetypes and parts, there's something sort of leading them. That's what self-leadership is. See, the way they explain it in Taoism is the mind is like a house, and it's filled with all these rowdy guests. And the rowdy guests are these archetypes. But the problem is there's no host that can bring order to these guests. And so the host is the original spirit or the center. And so the more that center, that host is introduced into the house, the more it could say, hey, sit down, knock it off, and just kind of put things in order. Without it, it's just a crazy house.
Do you see that maybe in the Western we have different leading archetypes? You mentioned the dragon, and the difference, between the East and the West. Are there certain values that are not as important to us, but they are more important over there, and vice versa?
Sure. There's different like shifts in cultural values in terms of cultural archetypes, and different epochs, like different time periods, also have different dominant sort of archetypal structures that lead the way. What at least I'm observing is that the Western ones tend to be spreading everywhere. So what we once called, even 50 years ago, East and West, is less obvious now. But yeah, it's and part of that is, again, that orange value structure is starting to dominate the entire world, at least second and first world countries. So,
man, we could go on for hours on this stuff. I can't wait to see your video with Keith. So,
same here.
So Scott, where can people find you? How can people get a hold of you? Get into some of your writing. How can people find out more about you?
Sure. Well, I have a repository of transformational guides available for free on scottjeffrey.com, and you could sign up for getting the latest ones. I've been told it's like a series of rabbit holes that you can go down, and they're all very in-depth guides. I try to make them very much about methods that you can use to do this type of stuff that we talked about, and they're all available for free. So,
I read something like 97% of your work is like absolutely free.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's super cool, and and thanks for all the stuff you do, because we are lacking shamans, and we are lacking thinkers, and we are we have a lot of entrepreneurs, and we have a lot of people that are producing and producers, but we need elders, and I think you are like the youngest elder within our tribe.
Well, at least an elder in training. I wouldn't call myself one yet.
Well,
sure.
Of course, because you're the elder, and you would say that. So nice to talk to you, man. I can't wait to see you at PaleoFX. And just continue geeking out on this stuff.
Certainly. Thank you for having me. It's a lot of fun.